Welcome to Sleepy Dark Past. Tonight's story is not about kings or gods, not about golden temples or sacred animals. Tonight's story is about one of the strangest, most unsettling professions to ever exist in the ancient world. A job that was neither glamorous nor heroic, a job nobody envied, yet one that was absolutely necessary. The job of collecting the bodies after battle. Imagine it. The clash of swords has ended, the screens have faded, the dust has settled. The battlefield lies silent, littered with corpses, the stench of blood and decay rising into the air. And then, as the warriors and generals march away, another group of men steps forward. Their task is not to fight, but to gather the dead, to drag the fallen from where they lie, to burn them, bury them, or sometimes leave them as offerings to gods. They were not celebrated in songs. They were not remembered in glory. But without them, ancient wars would have left behind not just grief, but mountains of rotting flesh. Let us begin at the edge of an ancient battlefield. It could be Greece, with hoplites lying in the dust, shields cracked and spears broken. It could be Rome, with legions shattered and corpses piled high. It could be anywhere China after the warring states' battles, or even the vast plains where Mongol horsemen clashed. Wherever men fought, men fell. And when they fell, someone had to clean up the mess. In ancient Greece, battles were ritual as much as strategy. Two armies met, fought face to face, and when one side broke, the victors stood tall while the losers fled. But what about the bodies? Greek tradition demanded that the fallen be honored, even enemies. After the battle, both sides often negotiated a truce to collect their dead. Special crews, sometimes relatives, sometimes hired workers moved across the bloody ground with carts, carrying corpses back for burial. These men were not warriors. They were cleaners of carnage. Their job was to turn chaos into order, to restore dignity to the dead, and perhaps to calm the anger of the gods. The work was brutal. The heat of the sun on unburied corpses turned the air foul within hours. Flies swarmed, flesh bloated, bodies stiffened in grotesque positions, mouths frozen mid-scream. The collectors had to lift them, drag them, sometimes pry weapons from their rigid hands. Imagine the smell, the weight, the endless repetition. Imagine working through hundreds, sometimes thousands of corpses, while trying not to vomit, while knowing disease was spreading with every breath. Ancient writers rarely described these men in detail, perhaps because no one wanted to think about them. They were shadows at the edge of glory, invisible but indispensable dot in Rome. The task often fell to slaves or low-class laborers. The legions marched on, leaving behind teams to burn or bury the bodies. Roman pragmatism turned death into logistics. Dig trenches, throw the corpses in, cover them with earth, move on. Sometimes mass graves held both Roman and enemy dead together, indistinguishable in the dirt. But in other cases, Roman soldiers were carefully separated, given markers, honored for their sacrifice. Enemies were left to rot, their bones bleaching under the sun. And yet, someone still had to move them, had to touch them, had to deal with the horror. That someone was the battlefield body collector Dot in China. Chronicles of the warring states describe vast fields of corpses, tens of thousands dead in a single battle. The victorious armies moved on, but peasants were forced to gather the dead. They built great burial mounds, stacking corpses layer upon layer, earth packed between them. Some of these mounds still exist today, grassy hills that look peaceful but hide rivers of bones beneath. Again, the work was not done by heroes, but by nameless laborers. Their hands touched history, but their names were lost to it. And what about disease? Ancient people knew little of microbes, but they knew the smell of death carried danger. They feared miasma, the foul air of decay. Collecting bodies was not just unpleasant, it was terrifying. Men who did the job were often shunned, treated as unclean, sometimes ritually purified afterward. They were both necessary and unwanted, existing at the edge of society, invisible until war made them suddenly indispensable. Think of it. War was celebrated with parades, monuments, songs. But the aftermath was cleaned by men who slipped away nameless into history. Without them, the battlefield would have been an endless charnel house. With them, the dead were honored, the land was cleared, and life could continue. They were the janitors of glory, the sweepers of death. No one wanted their job, but everyone needed it done. This was the strange, grim, and utterly human profession of ancient battlefield body collectors. Forgotten, invisible, yet as vital to war as the soldiers themselves. Asterisk in the ancient world, death on the battlefield was never just death. It was a passage, a spiritual problem, a cultural crisis. To leave a body unburied was to condemn the soul. And so, the work of the collectors was not only physical, not only about dragging corpses and filling trenches, it was ritual. Every culture wrapped its own beliefs around the dead, turning grim labor into sacred duty. Take the Greeks, for example. They believed the unburied dead could not cross into Hades. Their souls wandered the earth as restless shades, forever denied peace. Homer's Iliad tells us of fallen warriors begging for burial, pleading with the living to cover their bodies with just a handful of dust. A scrap of earth was enough to open the gates of the afterlife. And so, after a battle, a truce was often declared, both sides silently agreeing to stop killing for long enough to gather their dead. It was not mercy. It was religion. Collectors moved across the field, sometimes fathers carrying sons, sometimes strangers handling strangers. To bury a body was not just kindness. It was the difference between eternity and oblivion. The rituals were precise. In Athens, citizens who died in war were carried back to the city in solemn procession. Their bones, collected by nameless workers, were placed in cypress coffins. These coffins were paraded publicly so the city could mourn. One empty bier, a coffin with no body inside, symbolized the missing, those lost or unrecovered. The irony, of course, is that the glory was given to the funeral speeches, to orators like Pericles praising the sacrifice. But behind that ceremony lay the hidden toil of those who gathered the bones in the first place. Without them, the speeches would have had nothing to glorify. Rome, ever practical, turned burial into discipline. Roman soldiers were sometimes required to collect the bodies of their fallen comrades themselves, reinforcing loyalty even beyond death. But when the numbers were overwhelming, slaves or conquered peoples did the work. Mass graves were dug, lines of corpses laid down like logs, earth shoveled over them quickly. The rituals came later, prayers, libations, monuments. But the first act always was removal. Clear the field, tidy up the horror, make death manageable. Only then could Rome move forward, presenting itself as orderly, civilized, unshaken by slaughter. Other cultures had their own methods. Among the Celts, bodies might be left exposed, not out of neglect, but as offering. The collector's role here was stranger still, to move the corpses to designated sacred places, to ensure birds and beasts could devour them in ritual fashion. To us, it sounds grotesque, but to them, it was holy recycling, a way of returning flesh to the gods. The Persians practiced sky burials as well, leaving corpses on towers, stripped clean by vultures. Even here, someone had to move the bodies, to prepare them, to place them where they could be taken. Collectors were priests of practicality, their touch the first step in a sacred process. And always, hovering behind it all, was fear. F. Polluted. Touching the dead made you ritually unclean. The men who handled corpses were tainted, marked, avoided. In Athens, special purification rites cleansed them afterward: bathing, fumigation, prayers. In Rome, slaves could be discarded, replaced, forgotten. In every culture, body collectors existed on the edge, necessary yet despised, guardians of rituals they themselves were excluded from. They restored honor to the dead, but carried dishonor in life. Think of the paradox. To bury the dead was one of the highest duties of religion. Heroes demanded it, poets praised it, priests enforced it. Yet those who actually did the work were nameless, invisible. The speeches, the monuments, the myths they survived. The sweat, the stench, the trembling hands that lifted broken bodies, they vanished into silence. And yet, without them, the rituals would have collapsed. Without collectors, there would have been no burials, no offerings, no monuments, no peace for the dead. They were the invisible link between carnage and ceremony, the bridge between battlefield chaos and cultural order. They turned death into memory, slaughter into story doc. So the next time you hear of an ancient funeral or a heroic tomb, remember the men who made it possible, the ones who dragged the corpses, washed the bones, piled the earth. They were the true keepers of ritual, even if no one wanted to say their names aloud. To imagine the strange profession of battlefield body collectors is one thing. To picture the daily reality is another. It is easy to speak in grand terms: ritual, honor, duty. But what did it actually mean to walk into a field of corpses and begin the work? Let us not look away. Let us walk with them for a moment, step by slow step, into the practical horrors of their job. The battle is over. The last clash of swords has faded into silence. The army has moved on, banners carried high, songs already praising victory. The collectors approach. What greets them is not glory, but carnage. The ground is sticky with blood, trampled with footprints and hoof marks. Weapons lie broken, shields cracked, arrows scattered like dead birds. And among them, everywhere, the bodies. Some fresh, some bloated, some torn beyond recognition. The stench hits before the sight, the sweet, sickening odor of flesh already beginning to rot under the sun. Flies rise in black clouds. Dogs prowl the edges. Ravens perch nearby, waiting impatiently for the humans to finish their work. The collectors begin. They must separate friend from foe, though sometimes it is impossible. A Roman tunic soaked in blood looks much like a barbarian's when shredded. A Greek helmet split in half reveals a face that could belong to any city. In the warring states of China, corpses in identical armor piled so high became indistinguishable, and peasants dragging them into pits gave up on sorting them at all. They pulled, they heaved, they stacked until individuality vanished. One body was every body. The work was brutal, not only emotionally, but physically. A corpse is heavy. Heavier still when bloated with gas, when stiffened by rigor mortis. Imagine lifting a man whose body no longer bends, whose limbs resist you. Collectors pried swords out of locked fingers, broke bones to fit bodies onto carts, tore armor off to make them lighter. There was no dignity, only necessity. The task was to move the flesh before it poisoned the air, before disease spread, before the battlefield became a permanent graveyard. And there were dangers. Corpses carried plague. Collectors breathed the foul air, touched open wounds, cut their hands on rusty blades, risked infection with every movement. Ancient medicine could not save them if they fell sick. Many likely died from the very job meant to restore order. In Rome, slaves could be replaced. In China, peasants were conscripted by the thousands. In Greece, even citizens forced into the task returned home marked unclean, ritually polluted. They carried the battlefield in their lungs, their skin, their dreams. Sometimes the job required more than simple removal. In Greece, bodies were prepared for funeral pyres. Collectors piled wood, laid corpses upon it, and set the flames. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a greasy smoke curling into the sky. The living stood back, watching their companions reduced to ash. It was purification, they said, but the men tending the fire knew it as something else. Horror disguised as ritual. In Rome, bodies were buried in trenches. Collectors shoveled earth over faces still open-mouthed in silent screams. The dirt muffled them, turned them into silence. And always there were unfinished tasks. Not every body was found. Some lay in ravines, devoured by animals. Some were forgotten, bones left to whiten under the sun. Centuries later, farmers plowing fields in Greece, in Italy, in China still unearthed skulls, femurs, spearheads lodged in ribs. Evidence of battles that had once thundered, and of collectors who had once passed through. Unable to gather them all, the collectors themselves were invisible in history. Their hands touched every corpse, yet no poet sang of them. They left no inscriptions, no monuments. And perhaps they preferred it that way. To be known for such work was to carry shame. They did not seek glory. They sought survival. Payment, perhaps a meal, maybe the relief of finishing before disease consumed them too. But can you imagine their minds? To walk into a field where thousands had screamed and died only hours before. To see faces twisted, eyes staring blankly, mouths open as if still pleading. To drag them, one after another, until the difference between man and meat blurred. To return home, wash your hands, eat bread, kiss your child, all while knowing the stench of death clung invisibly to you. This was their life. This was their job dot. And so, when we think of ancient battles, we imagine heroes, generals, strategies. But beneath it all, behind the curtains of history, there were the collectors. Their reality was not maps and speeches, but broken bones and bloated flesh. They were the janitors of war, scrubbing away its filth so that memory could dress it in glory. Without them, there would have been no battlefield elegies, no funeral speeches, no solemn burials. Only rot, only silence. Only death lingering like a stain too large to hide. This was the practical horror. The work no one wanted, but everyone required. The profession that made history possible by erasing the traces of its ugliest truth. Asterisk. The battlefield body collectors were necessary. Without them, cities would rot. Rivers would choke with corpses. The air itself would turn poisonous. And yet, in almost every culture, they were despised. They lived in the shadows of society, tolerated but rarely honored, essential yet untouchable. They were the outcasts marked by death, shunned in life, remembered by no one. In Greece, to touch a corpse was to invite miasma, the pollution of death. Even relatives who buried their own dead required ritual cleansing afterward. But what of the men who touched not one body but hundreds, dragging them from the dust, loading them onto carts, heaping them into pyres? They became permanent carriers of death's taint. Priests might wash them with holy water, fumigate them with incense, force them to bathe in the sea, but suspicion lingered. They were the men who smelled of ash and rot, who had stared too long into the faces of the dead. They walked through the city, and others stepped aside, whispering. In Rome, where pragmatism often trumped superstition, the disdain was no less sharp. Collectors were drawn from slaves, criminals, or the very poor. To be assigned such work was not only miserable, but humiliating. You were a disposer of corpses, a job that earned no gratitude. Roman elites praised the glory of their legions, erected monuments to generals, carved the names of heroes into marble, but the men who cleared the battlefield afterward were erased. Their sweat, their sickness, their labor made Rome's victories possible, but their names dissolved into nothing. They were tools, not men. In China, the stigma was even more profound. To touch the dead outside your family was taboo, a contamination that marked you socially. Peasants forced into corpse collection returned to their villages as tainted figures. Some were not allowed to rejoin their communities until they had undergone purification rituals. Others were never truly accepted again. They became wanderers, drifting from place to place, called upon when death came in masses after battles, famines, plagues, and dismissed once the work was done. In times of peace, they were forgotten. In times of war, they were despised necessities. Every society found ways to push these men to the margins. In India, centuries later, the work of handling the dead fell to untouchables, people condemned to a permanent underclass because of their association with death. Though not the same, the principle was identical. Death pollutes, and those who deal with it must carry its stain forever. The collectors were not just laborers. They were symbols of contamination, human reminders that death could never be fully hidden. And yet, here lies the paradox. These men were shunned for touching death, but without them, life itself would have been unlivable. Imagine Athens after a great battle, thousands of bodies left uncollected. Disease would sweep through the city. Crops would be poisoned by rotting flesh. Families would never retrieve the bones of their loved ones. The very rituals that bound the community together would collapse. And so the outcasts were summoned. Invisible, despised, but absolutely indispensable. It is a cruel irony. To bury the dead was a sacred act, praised in poems, enshrined in religion. But those who actually performed the work were degraded. Priests might speak of honor, orators might praise sacrifice, but the collectors were denied both honor and praise. They touched the dead so that others could speak of dignity, while avoiding the labor that made dignity possible. They were ghosts in their own time, alive but treated as if already dead. And what of their own hearts? Did they resent the scorn? Did they accept it as the price of survival? We cannot know. No one recorded their voices. They left no memoirs, no speeches, no defiant inscriptions carved into stone. History ignored them because history prefers heroes. The blood-soaked farmer conscripted to drag corpses from a field left no words behind. Only silence. Only the quiet knowledge that his work allowed others to pretend that war was glorious, that death was honorable, that life could go on. The collectors lived on the margins, but in truth, the entire system of war depended on them. They were the invisible foundation upon which memory was built. Without them, the battlefield would have been eternal chaos. With them, it could be tidied into myth. They paid for this transformation with their own dignity, carrying the weight of death not only on their backs, but in their reputations, their social standing, their very humanity. They were outcasts, but outcasts upon whom civilization itself depended. When we close the scroll of history and look back at the great wars of the past, the names we remember are generals, kings, heroes. We speak of Alexander at Issus, Caesar at Versailles, the chin-crushing rival states. The chronicles are filled with battles, strategies, speeches of courage. But behind every shining name, every carved monument, there were other hands calloused, trembling, silent. The hands of the battlefield body collectors. And though history rarely mentions them, their legacy is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. Consider the monuments. In Athens, the bones of the fallen were gathered, displayed, honored. Who gathered them? Not the generals, not the orators, but the nameless workers dragging bodies into wagons. Consider the Roman triumphs, where victorious legions marched through the city streets. The stench of rot was absent, the battlefield cleared. Who made it possible? Slaves, laborers, despised men whose sweat scrubbed away the filth of war. Even in China, where great burial mounds still rise, what are they really? They are monuments not only to victory, but to labor layers of earth, shoveled over layers of corpses by peasants whose names were never carved into. Stone dot the collector shaped history in silence. Without them, the fields would have remained unclean, the air unbreathable, the memory unbearable. They transformed the grotesque into the manageable. They allowed poets to sing of glory without gagging on the stench of decay. They turned horror into heritage. And yet, they themselves became invisible, erased as if their work had never existed. Their legacy is paradoxical. To be absolutely essential, an utterly forgotten dot, and perhaps that is the true measure of civilization. Who do we choose to remember? We remember the men who caused the deaths, but not the men who cleared them. We exalt the makers of carnage, but ignore the cleaners of carnage. The collectors remind us that history is not written by the survivors. It is written by the storytellers. And storytellers prefer swords to shovels, generals to gravediggers. Still, the traces remain. Archaeologists uncover mass graves, charred bone pits, burial mounds. Each one whispers not only of battle, but of labor, of hands that dug and carried and buried. Sometimes in the soil, we find the tools they used, the carts they pushed, the ropes they pulled. They are ghostly fingerprints, the only evidence of men who walked through hell with no songs to follow them. Their legacy also lives in our discomfort. We still turn away from them. In modern wars, the work continues, bodies gathered, graves dug, fields cleared. Today, it is done by recovery units, by emergency workers, by nameless hands, wearing gloves and masks instead of linen tunics. And still, their faces rarely make the news. We look at parades, speeches, monuments. We do not look at the men hauling stretchers, zipping bags, sanitizing fields. The stigma endures. Death is necessary, but unwanted, and those who handle it remain invisible. And yet, perhaps invisibility is itself a kind of legacy. By being forgotten, they show us the edges of memory, the places history does not like to look. They remind us that beneath every shining story lies filth someone else had to clean. They remind us that glory is built on silence, and silence is built on labor. Their forgotten hands hold up the stage upon which history performs. So, tonight, as you think of battlefields, do not picture only the warriors. Picture the quiet figures who came after. Picture them walking slowly through the silence, torches in hand, lifting bodies one by one. Picture their sweat, their nausea, their fear. Picture their hands forgotten by history, but not by the earth that still holds the bones they buried. This is their legacy. Not names in books, not statues, not glory. Their legacy is the quiet order left behind, the cleared fields, the mass graves, the monuments that could be built because they first removed the rot. Their legacy is every battlefield that turned from horror into memory. And so, when you next hear of war, when you next see a parade, remember them. Remember the outcasts, the cleaners, the forgotten hands. For they, too, are part of the story. The part we rarely tell because it is too heavy, too grim, too real. You have been listening to Sleepy Dark Past. Tonight, we uncovered the strange job of ancient battlefield body collectors, shocking, grotesque, invisible, and essential. If this story has left you haunted, or at least heavy-eyed, then subscribe to Sleepy Dark Past. There are many more shadows waiting. Lost jobs, forbidden rituals, strange obsessions that shaped humanity. Until next time, let the past whisper you to sleep. Good night.